Hi, my name's Audra. Thanks for joining me today. Today, as we continue through the book of Acts, we're going to look at Acts chapter 16, starting in verse 16. So that will be easy to remember, Acts 16:16. And this section in the NIV is titled Paul and Silas in Prison. Paul and Silas are in Philippi and they are preaching the gospel. And day after day, what happens is a slave girl who has an evil spirit starts following them around and shouting, "These men are followers of the Most High God. They are saying the way to be saved." And she's shouting it and disruptive. And so even though what she was saying was true, Paul just finally gets so annoyed that he turns around and commands that the evil spirit leave her, and it does. We don't know what happens to the slave girl, but we do know that her owners were not happy. They had been profiting off of her fortune telling from the evil spirit, and now that extra source of income is gone. Ironically, the slave owners say that Paul and Silas were causing a disturbance, even though their slave girl was the one who was shouting and technically causing the disturbance. And so they take Paul and Silas to the magistrates, who were the judges, and they knew that these magistrates could issue punishments and prosecutions. The commentary says that Romans were a very proud people and easily offended, especially if anything appeared to be anti-Roman. So the slave owners knew how to press the buttons of the magistrates. They knew if they presented their case that Paul and Silas were causing a disturbance and what they were doing was anti-Roman, they were going to instantly get in trouble. And again, if you read the passage, the slave owners probably didn't care about Roman, anti-Roman. They were just mad that they weren't getting the money from the fortune telling of the slave girl any longer. And the slave owners were right. They knew what needed to be said to get Paul and Silas in trouble. And so instantly the magistrates order that Paul and Silas were to be beaten and thrown in jail. And in those days, Romans did not have a lot of laws or limits on beatings. So it's assumed that Paul and Silas were just beaten and flogged so severely that they could barely move. The text says that they were put in the inner cell of the prison. And this was done because they had driven out a demonic spirit. And so if someone did something that was supernatural, they needed to be put in the innermost part of the jail just to make sure they couldn't escape. And even though Paul and Silas were free, they didn't leave. Instead, Paul calls out to the jailer and he says, "Don't kill yourself, we're still here." Because he knew in those days, if prisoners escaped, the jailer would be punished, most likely by death. And so oftentimes, if prisoners escaped, the jailers would just take their own life. That was the typical reaction. And the story gets better. Not only did Paul and Silas save the jailer's physical life, they told him about Jesus. They continued to preach the gospel, and the jailer and his entire household were saved and baptized. The next morning, the magistrates send their officers to get Paul and Silas from the prison. And when they arrive, Paul and Silas ask them, "Why were we beaten? Why were we thrown in prison? We're Roman citizens." So the magistrates realized they acted out of haste. They just quickly jumped to the worst conclusion, threw Paul and Silas in prison after beating them, and now they knew they could get in a lot of trouble, and they themselves could be punished for what they did. And this is why at the end of this section, in verse 40, the magistrates plead with Paul and Silas. They insist, and they even escort them out of Philippi to get them out, to get them quiet, in hopes that they would not get in trouble for what they did. One thing that I've been learning as I've been studying and reading through the book of Acts is when I see a section, I think that God is going to take me one way. And as I start digging and researching a little more, He's been steering me in different directions. And that's no different from this chapter. I know this chapter is often used when teaching on worship, on how Paul and Silas worshiped in prison no matter how badly they felt, no matter what had happened. And then even the mention of hymns, sometimes this section is used for justification of song style preferences. But this section of Acts has so much more packed into it. The bottom line is that Paul and Silas were wrongfully beaten and thrown in jail. As I was preparing my lesson, I was reminded of the first Pirates of the Caribbean movie. And in the movie, a quote from one of the pirates is, "The code is what you'd call guidelines than actual rules." And I think that's a reminder that Satan isn't going to play by the rules. He isn't going to follow the guidelines. But as Christians, we do need to follow the rules. We do need to obey the guidelines that God has set out for us. I don't know if you've noticed this, but I think you will from now on and continue to notice it through the book of Acts, is that Paul preaches the gospel every single opportunity that he gets. No matter who he's talking to, no matter where he is, no matter what has happened to him, he continually preaches the gospel of Jesus Christ, and people are continually saved. In the book of Acts, I keep seeing this challenge over and over again to trust God no matter what, to be a witness for him no matter what. And that might be a challenge for you individually, for your family, for your church, but just remember that God will bring you through. Maybe you won't find out what has been going on until you get to the other side, or maybe he will just be glorified through your situation. So again, trust him no matter what, because with his help, you can do it. Thanks for joining me today. See you next time.